Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And this episode is going to be a brief update on the episode that we did a few days following the 60 Minutes episode that featured whistleblower David Nielsen and church finance. So this is going to be an interesting episode because there's a little bit more information that's come to light recently that we thought our listeners and viewers might find beneficial. So Landon, why don't you tell everybody what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the 60 Minutes episode, David Nielsen's lawyer, his name's Michael Sullivan, put out a press release telling basically what the charges were that they had filed. If you remember, I think it was back in February, they filed a 90-page briefing whistleblower complaint against the federal government, or against the church with the federal government, against Ensign Peak and the church. And so he goes on to basically outline what those complaints are and why they think they're valid. And after that point, we released our episode last Tuesday. The Deseret News, through the church's newsroom, released a pretty scathing article saying that, that 60 Minutes ignored all the good things the church did and just wanted to point out the bad things the church did, and said that they were unfounded allegations that they were making, even though they've already been found guilty on the SEC on the fraudulent 13F forms that they were filling out. So it just amazes you that they could even say that when they've just paid a $5 million fine for the allegations. But
yeah, if you go like this, it didn't happen.
It never happened.
It didn't happen. It never happened.
That's right. Just ignore what happened there. So we're going to go in and we're going to actually go over the press release from his lawyer, and we're going to read through it, and we're going to see what it is that they filed with the federal government. And then he goes on, he got interviewed by the Salt Lake Tribune on Friday, the 19th of May, and which point he updated a little bit of information that we didn't hear in the 60 Minutes investigation, which tells a little bit maybe where the investigation is and where the investigation is going. So
yeah, and I thought this was really good because, we've heard the filing, but we don't know exactly what they said. So this statement kind of goes through that. And to me, it was very interesting. Even though I followed everything else about it, there were new things in here that I had not seen expressed exactly in the way that they are. So I think it's important just to read through it, and it'll go really fast, but very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty short. This is going to be a short episode. We just wanted to get this information out. So Michael Sullivan, as I said, is the attorney who represents David Nielsen. He's a former federal prosecutor with more than 30 years of experience in civil and criminal litigation. He represents whistleblowers worldwide under the False Claims Act in the IRS whistleblower program. So this is what he does. This is his specialty, is whistleblower law. He was consulted by Congress in drafting the SEC whistleblower provisions of the Dodd-Frank financial reform law in 2020. He's met with the SEC and the CFTC commissioners to advise them on rules for their programs. And he's defended businesses and individuals in white-collar criminal investigations and prosecutions, including financial fraud and tax investigations. So he's been around the block a few times with these whistleblower allegations. I think it's fair to say he knows what he's doing. Obviously, he's the lawyer for David Nielsen, and so you're going to get David Nielsen side of the story from him. But this is an interesting look at what it is they have, or what it is they're claiming that they presented to the IRS to investigate. So we wanted to go ahead and get started by actually reading that, and we'll go through. It's just 3 pages long, and we're going to go through it paragraph by kind of the paragraph. It has headings in it, and we'll talk about each one. So he starts out, this is his statement that he put out, and this was the day after the 60 Minutes article, or the 60 Minutes episode aired. He says, on 60 Minutes, LDS Church admits bailout of for-profit business by Ensign Peak, which shows Ensign Peak cannot be tax exempt. That's his claim. Since ordinary citizens must obey the law, should the IRS and Department of Justice permit politically powerful church organizations to flout the law? This week, 60 Minutes broadcast a bombshell admission by an LDS Church representative. He confirmed our whistleblower client, David Nielsen's contention that the supposedly nonprofit Ensign Peak Advisors, Inc. bailed out a for-profit insurance company owned by the church. The amount, $600 million. A leading tax expert told 60 Minutes that it is a problem if they have moved money from a nonprofit to a for-profit. The expert, Professor Phil Hackney, also warned there's a real risk to the rule of law if the IRS does not come in and enforce those rules. Under U.S. law, the $600 million insurance company bailout, a private benefit to its policyholders, means that Ensign Peak cannot be tax exempt and thus owes billions in taxes. The bailout was one of several ways Ensign Peak disregarded our tax laws, according to Mr. Nielsen's sworn reports. But Ensign Peak's 2 decades of violations went beyond the tax laws. This is pretty straightforward. They're basically saying you bailed out Beneficial Life using $600 million from the fund of EPA, which was from a nonprofit organization to bail out a for-profit organization. And they consider that a private benefit. A private benefit means it benefited somebody specifically. It was not a general bailout that benefited everybody. It specifically benefited the church in that it got to not have to declare bankruptcy. There was also, some of the board of directors of Beneficial Life are apostles themselves. And probably most of the most of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 probably own Beneficial Life insurance policies, which means they basically save their own policies in case they die, which is kind of
or their
important
own something.
Yes, when you're 98 years old, those life insurance policies are pretty
take on a whole new meaning. Exactly. And I think that was a moment as we all watched the 60 Minutes interview where the interviewer said, did you take money from your nonprofit to, financially help your for-profit? And everyone kind of held their breath. And he said, the representative from the church, Bishop Wallen, said, we had sufficient resources to handle this, or something like that. So I think that was a big moment if people really understood what it meant. And right here in this statement, he's saying, look, you said it on air right there.
Now, he also did say, well, David Nielsen didn't know what was happening. He didn't have all of the facts. And several people have said, well, maybe they gave him a loan and that loan had interest and they have to pay that loan back with interest, which he did say most of that money's been paid back, and that would then represent basically an investment for the fund. And it's not really a bailout, but it's rather a loan with an investment return. The problem is when they asked, okay, where's the paperwork for that? The church refused to give it to him. And he goes on to make some other accusations here that I hadn't heard before that are kind of important. So do you want to read the next paragraph?
Yeah, let's just take turns reading. And again, a lot of this stuff just stated the way it's stated, I had not really heard before. So to me, this was extremely interesting. So he goes on to say in a bolded heading, 20 years of deception by misstatements to the SEC. He says, Mr. Nielsen made whistleblower reports to both the IRS and the SEC about violations by Ensign Peak. The cases are linked. Mr. Nielsen showed the SEC how Ensign Peak's unlawful SEC misstatements were calculated to conceal its tax violations. The SEC recently found almost 2 decades of misstatements, and this is always in quotes, misstatements involving Ensign Peak and the church in violation of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Congress made a willful violation of this law a felony. The SEC's action is but the first of many steps in essential government scrutiny, and next are the IRS and the Department of Justice. Why would an organization violate the law and misstate for almost 20 years facts that it was legally required to disclose? As Mr. Nielsen has reported and attested under oath, the organization's chief investment officer explained it. Making these disclosures in Ensign Peak name would risk the firm by endangering its tax-exempt status.
I think we all probably remember in the 60 Minutes interview where David Nielsen said that, he followed the guy after the meeting and said, "What does this mean?" And he said, "Dave, we could lose our tax exempt status." And that's as reported by Dave Nielsen. So that indicates that the top leaders at Ensign Peak knew that this could be a violation, and that they seemed to be scared that they would lose their tax exempt status if this was known. And that's why they were making these forms and filling out these forms they were. So that's the link he's trying to make. They filled out these forms, these 13 Fs, they intentionally filled them out wrong so that they wouldn't be caught that they had all of this money and that they were actually giving that money away and using it for for-profit entities. And
they were highly motivated to do that, because they need that tax exempt status. Absolutely. And I think it was Jana Reese in another article that said filing these F13s or 13s Fs in the incorrect way, that's not a mistake, as we've kind of heard. Doing it for this period of time, decades, that's a decision that someone made. It's not just a simple mistake. It's actually a decision. And I have to say, I think I agree with that. There doesn't seem to be any other explanation.
Yeah, you don't set up 13 shell companies by accident.
Right.
They were clearly set up to do this.
Yep.
So, okay, he goes on in the next bolded sentence. He says, facts negating tax exempt status. What facts was this official referring to that threatened Ensign Peak's tax exempt status? While a thorough audit and investigation by the IRS and Department of Justice must answer that question fully, Mr. Nielsen has revealed plenty. Mr. Nielsen states, as Ensign Peak's investment fund amassed billions of dollars derived from tithing funds, large assets were deleted from its books. A practice I pointed out was improper, but was shocked to learn continued. And instead of using these billions in its investment fund for religious, charitable, or educational purposes, it used its funds to build a luxury shopping mall, about $1.4 billion, and to bail out a for-profit insurance company, about $600 million. These are clearly prohibited private benefit, again in quotes, transactions, which are enough to negate tax-exempt status. And what policyholders personally profited from this bailout of $600 million? Didn't the bailout benefit any Ensign Peak and church leaders who held policies with money that should instead have been used for charitable, religious, or educational purposes? And that was all bolded. Church leaders such as Thomas S. Monson promoted those policies and approved the bailout. Any such private inurement would also disqualify Ensign Peak from tax-exempt status. So does the deletion of large assets from Ensign Peak's books. So basically what he's saying, a private inurement is when you use a religion, if you're set up as a religion, you cannot use that money to benefit one person or a small group of people. And that's what he's claiming is by bailing out the beneficial life, they basically save the policies of themselves. And probably I'm imagining a lot of the church employees also have these policies, and that's what they were doing, was they were bailing them out for their own good, not really for the good of the public or any other reason. It was for themselves. So as a church, if you're a church, you can't take all of these profits you can't take the tithes from a church and then use them as the preacher, and they go only to you, because then you're not a church.
People have tried.
People have tried.
We know cases where people have tried very public, right? Smaller scale, of course, but yeah, you cannot do that.
Yeah, and you can only give them to yourself if that's a salary. You have to then disclose. You have to use that as a salary, and in this case, this isn't a salary. They're giving it to a specific entity that's owned by this institution. And so that's
exactly what did you think about the section in there where it said the deletion of large assets from Ensign Peak's books? I've heard that mentioned before, but just touched on, like, I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but I know David Nielsen said that there may be missing assets, that there doesn't seem to be any explanation for where they went.
Yeah, I read that carefully because I've heard that possibly that the apostles and the general authorities are paid out of this fund, and that's why they make the claim that
Okay.
that they're not paid by tithes of the church. They're going to claim they're
That
paid
makes
by
sense.
interest on the tithes of the church. However, as I read this carefully, he only makes mention of the 600 million and the mall. So I think he's only talking about those two assets. But it is possible from the way he stated it that he is inferring that there may be more large assets or transfers of funds that came out of this account that nobody that aren't accounted for or that
Right.
have been hidden from the public.
Yeah, I felt he might be inferring something, but again, that's just an inference and we can't really comment. But it makes you think there may be more to come out. We don't know. We're still trying to unravel this. It's tricky. Do you want me to read the next
Sure.
paragraph
Yep.
here?
Absolutely.
Okay, this is in bold: fake numbers and false responses to the IRS. And what about fake numbers and false responses on IRS returns? Like its misstated SEC filings, Ensign Peak filed IRS returns that listed the book value of its billions in assets as only 1 million. I'm reading that wrong. Only 1 million. Ensign Peak's returns also attested under oath that it had no foreign accounts. Only once detected did Ensign Peak stop this deception. Only after Mr. Nielsen's original IRS submission was leaked against Mr. Nielsen's wishes, the lawyer is making this clear, in late 2019, Ensign Peak admitted in its recent IRS returns that it does indeed own foreign accounts. And only then did Ensign Peak begin to make its SEC filings in its own name as the SEC found. So everything started to change in 2019. The way that they reported, the way that they revealed information, everything started to change in 2019 when David Nielsen's report became more public.
Which is incredible when they say they're unfounded allegations, yet they made a whole lot of changes as soon as he made the allegations, which tells you they knew that they'd been caught. And this is really to me important. They're saying that they filled out IRS returns that showed that these accounts that had billions of dollars in them were only worth $1 million. They falsified IRS forms is what they're saying, and that they under oath they said that they had no foreign accounts, when in fact they're saying it's now been found that they do have foreign accounts when they started filling out the forms right. So
I picture them saying something like, those? Oh, we forgot about those.
We forgot about those. We're just old men. We don't
I'm
know
so
anything about
sorry.
it. Yeah, and it's the interesting thing in the paragraph above was if you caught that, was Mr. Nielsen said that he told them that this was not allowed. So they were clearly advised that they were breaking the law, and they ignored it. So again, it was a decision to do this. This was not accidental bad filing. You don't accidentally, this is like you filling out your income tax and saying that you made $1 when you made $100,000 that year. You can't overlook that every year and say, wow, I only earned $1 this year. That doesn't sound right. And not say, wow, there may be a mistake here. But instead you sign the form and send it in saying you only made $1.
Exactly. And we have examples of the higher ups that prepared these kinds of forms for other companies they owned privately and did the forms perfectly. And yet when they are handling these for Ensign Peak, they were prepared in this other way. And we actually did an episode sort of about this, didn't we, Landon? I think we'll link this in the notes too. Yeah, it's very interesting. There's been a lot of talk about this. So very interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely seems to be something going on, and they're making the claim, and according to the lawyer, they've given this to the IRS. So the IRS has had this information. And so he's calling on him. You need to do an investigation because we've given you, and I think he's kind of calling out the IRS in this letter. So, okay, the next paragraph in bold: recent change in tactics designed to confuse. In Ensign Peak's public statements over the past 3 years, to our knowledge, Ensign Peak never disputed that its investment fund was not in bold, used for religious, charitable, or educational purposes through 2019. Now, 3 years later, the church has attempted to dispute Mr. Nielsen's sworn statement that Ensign Peak never used its $100 billion investment fund for religious, charitable, or educational purposes. But when 60 Minutes challenged the church to provide documents disproving Mr. Nielsen's statement, the church apparently declined. So he said, hey, for the 3 years since 2019 that you've known about this, you never said that it was not used. You always gave the indication that it was used for religious, charitable, and educational purposes. And now when you're called to the carpet, you are saying that it wasn't used for, that it was used for these purposes. And they're going, that's misleading. For 3 years, you never said that. And now all of a sudden you're changing your story when 60 Minutes comes around. In fact, this is where he kind of says, okay, you said that it was a loan that was going to be made. Let's get the documents. Show us the documents so we can see the loan. And the church is like, no, we're not showing you the documents. So
how easy would it be just to show the paper trail? Look, this is what we did. Here it is. That is how you defend yourself. If you are really telling the truth, especially in this scenario, you will have a massively documented paper trail that you can show to anyone to explain what was happening.
And again, even if they gave a loan, if that loan was 0.5% interest, that turns into a private inurement again, because you don't get a loan for that amount of money. You are using non-tax, tax deferred dollars or non-tax dollars, nonprofit dollars to bail out a profit. You're giving them a benefit that they wouldn't otherwise have just because the fact that you're linked to them. And so he's pointing that out and saying that, all right, church, show us the documents. You tell us that we misunderstood it. Give us the documents so we can understand it. But we all know the church
not that much to ask
is not going to do that. So, okay, we're down
so
to the last
easy.
page.
We could stop making episodes if they would
That's
just
right.
do that.
That's right.
We'll make a whole episode that said the documents are in, and we'll show everybody everything. So we'd love to do that. So, all right, we're down to the final sections here. This one in bold says this 100 billion investment firm is not tax exempt and owes billions in taxes. And that's really what this whole thing boils down to, isn't it? Billions of dollars in taxes are owed. It says Ensign Peak has failed to come close to being tax exempt, not even close. And the reasons are many. Our laws require that for an entity such as Ensign Peak to be tax exempt under IRC 501c3, it must be operated exclusively for religious, charitable, or educational purposes. Ensign Peak has consistently failed to operate in this way. It also cannot engage in private benefits transactions, such as the $600 million bailout of a private for-profit insurance company. Ensign Peak has failed to abide by this limitation, nor can it engage in any private inurement transactions. This would include benefits to any leaders of Ensign Peak or the church who had policies with the bailed out insurance company. Moreover, Mr. Nielsen's reporting the deletion of large assets from its books warrants a full IRS and DOJ audit and investigation to determine where these assets are now and to identify anyone who has benefited from deleting these accounting records. Deleting accounting records strongly suggests private inurement. So he just kind of goes through everything right there, all of the reasons that Ensign Peak, as he said, has failed in even coming close to be tax exempt. And that, I found that paragraph very enlightening, because there they are right there, all spelled out. This is what David Nielsen is saying.
Yeah, and this to me is a bombshell. They're accusing them of deleting accounting records. They're saying you got rid of the records and destroyed the evidence of these transactions. and that is against the law. You're hiding something. And so that to me is a real bombshell that they're accusing them of deleting accounting records. Now, I'm not an accountant. I'm not an attorney. I don't know these things, but I do know that you have to hold on to tax records for a certain amount of time. And I don't know how long that is for corporations. I think it's different for corporations than it is for individuals.
Yes, it is.
But, for the church, the longer this drags out without the IRS investigating it, they can start destroying records in the past, So unless the IRS serves them with something that says you are no longer allowed to destroy anything related to this lawsuit, the church could go ahead and destroy all these old records while the IRS is doing an investigation. And I think that's why they're saying, look, it's time for you guys to do this investigation. We provided you this information 3 years ago. You need to do an investigation. And people are going to point out from this paragraph here, that, they're claiming that the church would owe billions in taxes if they lose their tax exempt status. David Nielsen would get a large portion of that. As part of this Whistleblower Act, I think you get like a third of whatever's recovered.
Whatever is recovered. That's absolutely how it works for any whistleblower that draws attention to any kind of malfeasance in a company. They do receive a portion of what is recovered.
So, you're going to hear the church say, he's just doing this for the money. He's trying to collect the money. I actually think that this is a benefit for the rule of law, because we heard during the 60 Minutes episode, we heard the IRS agent say there wasn't the political will to investigate this, that it was highly dangerous I think is the words he used to pursue investigation in this.
Yeah, there was great risk, which was so interesting to hear coming from an IRS agent, that political risk. And it was a little confusing to hear that, because I think a lot of people think, just look into it. If they're exonerated, they're exonerated.
But the fact that he stands to make money if this is investigated and found to be true, I don't know about this. We'd have to have some legal people weigh in on this, but does he now have a case to go to the IRS and say, I filed a claim, I stand to make money off of this, and you didn't do your job and do the investigation that was required of it. And you cost me hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in recovered award that I could have had you investigated this and found what I told you was true to be true. And so I don't know if that gives him any standing. It's hard to sue the government. I know there's a lot of laws that say you can't sue the government, but you may be able, there may be an opportunity there that he can sue the government. At least he has the right to go in and say, I've provided the paperwork. I stand to profit from this if they were in fact doing something illegal. And the great thing about this is, hey, he only stands to make money if you were in fact doing something illegal.
That's right. That's why those attacks against him,
nothing to worry about.
Exactly. That's why those attacks against him are ridiculous, because he only does benefit if there was something going on that was not correct. So.
All right. Do you want to read the last paragraph there?
Let's see. What are we on? The risk to the rule? Is that what we're on? The very final one? Okay. In bold letters, it says risk to the rule of law requires IRS and Department of Justice action. So he says, to quote Professor Hackney again, there's a real risk to the rule of law if the IRS does not come in and enforce these rules. That was another quote from the 60 Minutes. It was Professor Hackney who was talking about why the IRS doesn't seem to be jumping on it. And I'll read it again. He says there's a real risk to the rule of law if the IRS does not come in and enforce those rules. The evidence provided by Mr. Nielsen, including the bailout now admitted by the church, should be fully investigated by the IRS and the Department of Justice. They must not shrink from the responsibility of enforcing the rule of law. Otherwise, a powerful, well-connected organization will be seen as escaping the equal application of our laws, above the law, in other words. And that is a very dangerous precedent if there is an organization that is above our law.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, if you go into the Salt Lake Tribune uh, article that they, and we're gonna read a couple quotes from there in just a minute. They went to him and asked some questions about this, and it became apparent, during the 60 Minutes interview, they asked, why now? And he said, well, I felt like the time is right. Um, he makes mention that he gave every professional courtesy to the IRS. And it sounds to me like he's sick and tired of nothing happening. He's like, I filed this 3 years ago.
Right.
I tried to keep it quiet. I didn't leak it. I was going to let you guys do the investigation with nobody knowing where I stood, just, where no one would accuse me of knowing things, or I wanted to be completely anonymous and have you guys do an investigation, but you haven't done it. And now it's time. And now I'm going to let 60 Minutes know, and I'm going to let the press know about this. And I want an investigation. I want my complaint investigated to see if,
especially on the heels of the SEC, right?
Especially
that
on
was
that.
investigated and they were
It's
found
like
guilty.
what I told you there was fact. Why aren't you believing me? IRS
Yep,
and
let's look at the
DOJ,
rest.
why aren't you investigating and believing me now that you've seen what happened with the SEC? So I do want to show, go back to the slides here. There were a couple things that were said in the interview that he actually addresses, that Mr. Sullivan addresses with the Salt Lake Tribune, and that's the church's response, basically blaming, or the Bishop Waddell's response, where he said, "Oh, it was the lawyers that did it." So this is out of the Salt Lake Tribune. The story is called "Pressure Builds to Investigate LDS Church Wealth" in Sunday's Salt Lake Tribune. It says, at the time of the settlement, the Utah-based Faith, while expressing regret for its filing mistakes, in quotes, said it considers this matter closed, in quotes. Church officials blamed the reporting violations flagged by the SEC on misguided advice from attorneys, saying, "We affirm our commitment to comply with the law." Sullivan said Friday that blaming the church attorneys for the deception was not credible. It's incredibly disingenuous to say that, well, we were relying on our lawyers and making misstatements for 20 years in violation of the law. He said, if that were true, Sullivan added, the SEC would have prosecuted the lawyers. Those lawyers probably wouldn't have licenses today. And that's what many of the post-Mormon world has been saying on the podcasts all over the place is, no, if the lawyers were involved and you blamed the lawyers, you would have had to open up you would have had to drop all requirements, privilege with your law firm, and let the SEC come in and investigate what those lawyers were telling you. And if those lawyers were advising you, what they were advising you was against the law, then those lawyers would be disbarred for what they did. And this is 20 years. You think it was the same lawyer that would have been advising them of this for 20 years? And we know for a fact that the church's own audit department twice found this and told them. And according to Mr. Nielsen, he also told them that what they were doing was wrong. And so the church leaders knew that this was wrong, and they chose to ignore it. And so he brings that out in the paper and addresses, this was repeated again, I think, in the Deseret News when they released their thing.
Yeah, they mentioned that again. And when I talked about the episode we had done before, it was an episode where we kind of aggregated the defenses of why the SAC situation might have happened. And that was one of the number one ones, that most faithful Mormons believed that they were just a victim of faulty, advice from attorneys. That was a huge reason that they were able to think, okay, this is why it happened. But as Landon's pointing out, that would have been their defense. They actually probably would have gotten off with it, right, by saying that our lawyers told us, and they would have been we'd still be in the middle right now of a big investigation that would have been opened up. What advice did they get? When did they get it? Who gave them the advice? It would have allowed the church to remove themselves a little bit, but that didn't happen because the lawyers did not give them bad advice. So,
yeah, and I want to bring, if you look at this graph that we have on here, our friend Spencer Anderson accounting professor at University of Illinois, gave us this that was put out by the Widow's Mite. And this points out how serious what they did at the SEC was. All the members are wanting to say, oh, it was just a traffic ticket. It was just a small paperwork violation. This shows how rare it is that anyone gets prosecuted for Section 13F violations. It hardly ever happens. You can see here from 2007 was the last time it looks like anyone was fined for this. So almost, what's that, 2007, 21, 14, 15 years. Nobody was charged for this because it's so easy to fill out that nobody's ever made a mistake on it. But you look at that red line, the church was fined $5 million. That's 50 times the largest fine that anyone was ever fined for this. This is huge. This was punitive. They were pushing and saying, you intentionally did this. This was horrendous. This was deceitful, and you're going to pay a large fine. So for an organization that has billions of dollars, 5 million is not large, but this graph is really telling because it shows just how egregious the SEC saw this this hiding of the money to be by the church. And
that was another thing that we found out when we sort of polled faithful members. They said it was $5 million. That's nothing at all. You don't understand it in perspective. It is nothing to a $150 billion fund, but 50 times what you would normally be fined, it does say something.
Yeah,
if you
and not what you'd normally be fined, 50 times what the largest fine ever before that was. A normal company would probably be fined just a few $100. But you know, the biggest fine prior to that was $100,000 by Quattro. Before that, $12,000. So this was a huge fine for what they did.
Statement, like you said, it was a statement. Absolutely.
There were a couple other things in the interview with the Salt Lake Tribune. And for those of us that watched, we were maybe a little depressed, I guess, by what we found.
Disheartened is the word. I think a lot of people.
Disheartened is probably the correct word. Yes. About the fact that it looked like nobody was going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Sullivan, in the Salt Lake Tribune, it says, for his part, Sullivan said in an interview Friday, the IRS has confirmed within the past 6 weeks, that the evidence and analysis submitted on Nielsen's behalf is under consideration by the appropriate people. So he's saying within the last 6 weeks, this evidence has been submitted to the right people at the IRS. Now, that doesn't mean the IRS is going to do anything with it. It just means it's been submitted. And that, I guess, was the disheartening part of the Salt Lake Tribune piece, because they actually contacted the office of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, who would be in charge of investigating this through the IRS and their subcommittees. The senators that are in charge of the IRS and this type of work, they came back, and it turns out that the chairman of the committee is Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, and its ranking Republican member is Senator Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho, who is a Latter-day Saint. So this is what the IRS agent was saying, that had political risk and not the political will, because you've got one member who is a Latter-day Saint who probably has been to the temple and has probably made a covenant that he would, give everything he has to protect the church.
Protect the name of the church, protect the church.
Yeah, and so which oath is he going to
Absolutely.
follow at this point? His oath as a senator or his oath as a church member? Which one's more important to him at this point? The other senator, Senator Rod Wyden, is not a member of the church. However, Oregon has a fair number of LDS people, and a large constituency that would be LDS. They also made a call for Senator Michael Bennett, who is over one of the subcommittees, the Panels on Taxation subcommittee, and he's a Democrat from Colorado. which also has a large LDS constituency in it. So you can see the landmines that politically the church is counting on to disarm this investigation. And that's why I think Mr. Sullivan came out punching, saying, you IRS have a responsibility to investigate this. You cannot let the politicians derail this. You have a responsibility to investigate. So it looks like it's been put in the hands of somebody, whether that gets upset by politicians or not. We may not find out. The IRS does not comment on whistleblower allegations. Therefore, we probably, unless there's actual charges that come out of it, we may never know if or what they did. But it does look like maybe the documents are in the right hands to begin being looked at. The SEC did something. Let's see if the IRS and the Department of Justice will do the same.
That's right. It happened. And I think maybe you stand on the shoulders of the SEC a little bit, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a positive step forward. But I just found this very interesting. I mean, it really brought to light lots of things, or it's maybe clarified some things that I hadn't really seen before. And I feel like the pressure is definitely on now with the 60 Minutes interview and people kind of waking up and saying, wait, what? So I think we're going to see a lot more. I can be hopeful. I'm determined not to be disheartened anymore and to maybe be hopeful. What about you?
Yeah, no, this gave me a little bit of hope that it will at least be investigated. And if the church didn't do anything, great. Well, let's see it. But it's hard to believe when we just saw what happened with the SEC filings that they're honest and they're dealing with the IRS, just not with the SEC. David Nielsen has proven to be accurate with what he has alleged so far. And after watching the show, I really found that he was a more believable witness, if you want to say, than the church's spokesman, Bishop Waddell was. So I'd like to, I don't want to make a judgment based on hearsay or non-evidence. I want to see what happened. Show us. If you did nothing wrong, it should be easy to show us. But the hiding is the problem. And that's where they're losing the trust. So,
well, we found out it's not secrecy. It's not secrecy. It's confidentiality. And we learned that while we thought those were synonyms, they're not. Synonyms are hard. So, there's a difference there. But anyway, all right. Enough of all this. We just found this very interesting. I had not heard from the lawyer before or even known who he was. So now we're a little more in the know about that. And we will continue to keep everybody informed as things happen. Do you have any final statement, Landon, or we will finish up here?
I think it's time to finish up. We wanted to keep this short and just let people know about this because it came out after the 60 Minutes episodes.
Exactly. So we'll put a lot of links in the show notes for different things that we've mentioned, and go ahead and dig in yourself. There's a lot to go through there. And again, the Widow's Might, we can't say enough how wonderful that group is in getting information out, transparency and clarity. You can go to their website, the Widow's Might, and they have a lot of information there that you can do your own digging, and let us know what you all think in the comments. What have you found? What have you learned about this topic? What do you hope for going forward? So please communicate with us. We love it. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Mormonish and hit the notification bell if you'd like to be made aware when new episodes come out. And we'll say goodbye for now. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.